All right.
Okay. Close.
Hi, my name is Hazel Williams, and I'm so happy to be here at the Digital Media Conference and to learn about your literacy project. It's one that I think is very appropriate for several of the communities that I'm involved in. And most specifically, as I was sitting in one of the sessions, I thought about language as an expression of culture. And I think it's much more than an expression of words that have a meaning, conveying a message to someone. It's actually an expression of culture. I think specifically about people that I know who were born and live in the South, or perhaps migrated north in the Great Migration. I think about one person in particular who was initially a sharecropper. Her family was a sharecropping family, and she had several siblings, and they all worked on the sharecropping plot. Many of the children had to drop out of school early, perhaps in middle school or early high school, to help on the family plot, and also to generate income for their families. But it's interesting to me that these folks, even with what many would call an abbreviated formal education, that they're still very educated in the sense that they bring a depth of understanding to their lives, and they're able to accomplish great things without the letters behind their names that indicate a particular degree. And then I think about language as culture and as an expression of culture. For instance, in the South, "madeir" is a word that's used. And I asked about it, and it actually is an abbreviation of "mother dear." And I look at it further as it expresses the culture of how dear the mother is in the African American community, and how dear she is, especially in a community where often the men were threatened, where there was intense activity against men, black men in particular, that often the woman was called upon to be the one who was the hub of the family, or the one who had to hold things together. So I look at those women, they were especially precious and called "mother dear," shortened to "madeir." And even today I find it in some of the popular culture. There's a movie that's popular. I think it's called "Madeir's Family Reunion." Oh, yeah, and not to give them a plug, but I think it's just interesting that it's made it into the culture.
Are you ready to get your literacy now?
Not right now, but I'm going to send you an email.
Please do, because I will come and interview you.
Yes. I'll do that. Okay.
That's great.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
So tell me a little bit more about the when you were growing up, when you were a child, and you were learning how to read. Did your mom read to you?
Yes, she did. And it's interesting, when I was talking to you about the people who came out of that background, I was actually speaking of my mother. My mother is madeir. My mother is the one who stopped her formal education in the 9th grade and worked on the family farm, first as a sharecropper, and then later on when her father was able to have enough money to buy his own farm. That there were small farmers, and later were able to purchase more land where they grew timber and were able to take crops to the market. But yes, I remember her reading to me, and also it's interesting, she realized though that education was a form of freedom. It was looked upon not just as a way of expressing oneself or of being correct in polite society, but it was looked upon as freedom. I'm sure we've heard often that knowledge is power. I say that applied knowledge is power. So she wanted us all to make sure that we obtained an education so that we could write our own ticket, or make our own way, or to be free of the constraints of ignorance. Ignorance is really a prison, if you will. So she always emphasized that, and it's so interesting that with the 9th grade education, my father did graduate from high school, and then he attended some college. But it's interesting for my mother, such a push. All of her children attended college on academic scholarships.
And that was no mistake.
No, it was by design. It was by design.
Now, what kinds of books and reading materials did she keep around the house?
She always had
Read the Bible?
Well, of course, she read
Yeah.
the Bible, being religious, but she also had other books that I think would be called academic in nature. We had Scientific America. We had Scholastic. What was it?
The
Scholastic
Scholastic books.
Journal
Yeah,
or something like that.
yeah.
We had the World Book Encyclopedias. And of course, we had to go to the library and read books and write reports for her.
Oh,
So
that's
it was
interesting.
very, very important
Yeah.
for her,
Yeah.
for us to read and to read well. And it is so interesting, even with, I think there's something else, language as an expression of culture or literacy as an expression of culture.
Yeah.
A lot of people assume or think that one with a limited formal education would be inarticulate.
Yeah.
It is so interesting. My mother is one of the most articulate people I know. And in terms of her use of words, her use of language, and she has a great stage presence as well. She and her sister. Oh no, girl. She and her sister actually were famous for performing plays as teenagers and then carrying that forward into the community. And, and it's so interesting that she did that. And I just think it's such a great. So when I heard about this project today,
Yeah.
I thought, wow,
Yeah.
what a great thing. And I would love to record not only her,
Yeah.
I'd love to record my mother. There are some of her peers that
Oh,
had
that'd be
similar
terrific.
experiences. And I just look at her. I just look at her journey from growing up first as a sharecropper to owning a farm to moving to the city to becoming a part of what would be called, I guess today, commercial culture.
Yeah. Right.
And it's so interesting though. But I think it gives a solid foundation and a firm background to those of us who had the good fortune to be her children.
And here's something. So many of the black women that we have interviewed that come from the South, the very first thing that they remember in their house is a set of encyclopedias.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And often sold by somebody who would come around and
Yes,
sell
exactly.
encyclopedias.
And I'm sure that's how ours were purchased, but I remember that because I remember looking up subjects in the encyclopedia as a footnote for a paper in school.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was a huge, that was an investment, a family investment in literacy.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
And it was very important. Like I said, my parents clearly understood that education was freedom.
Yes.
Simply put,
Yeah.
education was freedom. And I don't mean education for the sake of saying that you know something.
Yeah.
I don't mean that kind of education, but education that could be put to use, that could be practical, that would serve as a way of negotiating the world to achieve a positive result.
Now, your parents rewarded you for literacy.
Yes.
They were so happy that you did it. They always give you, good strokes and stuff like that.
Yes.
But were you ever in school? Did you ever encounter any time when you were told not to read and write, or you were told not to read and write in a certain way?
Yes and no. Yes and no.
Tell us the story.
Okay. In my early years, I was born in the South, so I attended an all-black school, and there I even had a couple of my instructors were actually my cousins. In other words, they were my father's cousins, so they were my second cousins. So in school, and it wasn't just because they were my relatives, but that was just the norm. Everyone was expected to do well. Not do well, you were expected to do well and excel. You were expected to do your.
So you said excel.
No, I was trying to say I was deciding upon exceed or excel, so I blended the two.
I thought it was that Southern coming out.
Oh no, yeah. Well, I don't know, but I was deciding upon a word.
God, this is good. My husband has that Southern accent that comes out.
Really?
So,
okay. I was deciding on whether to exceed or excel, which one would be most appropriate. But we were expected to do well.
Yeah.
And we did. And as I hear today, a lot of students say that it's not cool or not hip or not whatever to be smart, but we were expected to be smart, and we lived up to what was expected of us.
Yeah.
And it was encouraged. And then my father's employment transferred him to Ohio. And it's interesting, then I was put into an all-white environment. well, with the exception of myself, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
or a few others,
Mm-hmm.
a few
Right.
others. And I recall there that was it was interesting. It was my first encounter with racism. It was my first encounter because in my community, everyone was African American. My dentist was African American. My physician was African American. If you had to go to the lawyer was out. The people who came to pick up the dry cleaning, Mr. Christmas, I remember he owned his own dry cleaning store. He would come around and pick up your dry cleaning, give you a receipt right on the front porch, and clean your clothes and come back and deliver them. So when I moved to Ohio, I remember being in a predominantly white school, middle school and high school. And there, what should I say? Of course, I continued to do well because that was our training, that was our upbringing.
Yeah.
You're supposed to do well in school. But I remember in high school, was it in high school? Yeah, I remember, it's interesting. My first encounter with racism, one of the white instructors seemed to be taken aback by the fact that we were, what should I say, that we were articulate and that we were good students, and perhaps even sought to, what should I say, even sought to diminish our desire to learn. And it was very interesting, and I remember explaining this to my parents. It was interesting. Both of my parents went to the school. My mother and father went to the school and spoke with the teacher. I remember that. And I'm sure that it continued in subtler and more covert ways. But that overt, well, because I remember even being discouraged from pursuing certain things. Yeah. So it's interesting that exists, because people talk about racism in the South, but I would think that it's just as prevalent. For instance, my experience, I experienced no racism in the South, but that's because I lived in an all-black community. But in moving to Ohio and being exposed to that type of environment, there are still many, racism is an institution in the United States.
Yes, it is.
And that's not what I meant to cover on this literacy statement. But I think it's important to always keep one's own goals in mind, to always be clear about what we're seeking to accomplish, and to continue marching that way, regardless of the obstacles that one might encounter, be they from a teacher or from an institution or from whomever. So,
and not forget history, which is why we do this work.
Exactly, and it's so important because, there are so many things that I'm just so excited that you're doing this, and I think it's just wonderful because I think about women at my mother's church now, and men too. Oh, I think that there's a whole there's a whole group of them who are about 80. There's some in their 90s. I think there's even one centenarian. I think it would just be wonderful to hear their stories and to hear about learning. So thank you so much for talking with me.
Thank